Chapter 1. The changing room smelled of stale plimsolls, young armpits, and unwashed bottoms, even now when the boys responsible had become young men and gone off to make their ways in the world. The August sunlight filtered through high panes with no particular enthusiasm. It touched upon empty lockers, unemployed clothes pegs, and peely paintwork. It didn't make much of the singular individual draped upon the low bench beneath the window, but then why should it? The sun had far better things to be doing and far better places to be, as did the sitter on the bench. His name was Cornelius Murphy, and he was the stuff of epics. Cornelius was a tall boy who had not as yet grown into his body. His limbs dangled and seemed forever uncertain what they should be doing with themselves. His dark hair, however, had made up its mind. It chose to defy all discipline and form precarious waves. These broke in whatever direction the mood took them. Cornelius had a noble brow in the making, a fine aquiline nose, sharp grey eyes, and a wide mouth which was, like as not, to be found smiling. It wasn't smiling now. Cornelius turned up his wristwatch and viewed the hour. A little after 10 of the morning clock. The world awaited him. The tall boy rose awkwardly, stretched, and put his best foot forward. He opened the door and prepared to make good his escape. The burly figure of the games master barred his way and shouted the words, "Science room!" into his left ear. The science room windows were within easy reach of the schoolkeeper's chamois. They were clean. The August sun entered them with gusto. The mahogany work tables, mottled by youthful mis-experiment, shone with a rich, dark patina. The Edwardian display cases, containing apparatus whereby Boyle's law could be proven beyond all reasonable doubt, veritably twinkled. Bunsen burners, petri dishes, retorts, and test-tube holders winked enticingly. In a drawer the litmus paper mused upon which way to turn. At a desk before the window sat a pale man in a dark suit. He was a man driven. His name was Mr. Yarrow, and he was the Youth Employment Officer. To this pale and hollow man fell the enormous responsibility of placing every school-leaving boy in full-time employment before the end of his final term, and Mr. Yarrow went about this task as one possessed, for indeed he was. Under Mr. Yarrow's guiding hand, the reputation of the school was untarnished these 5 long years. He had seen to it that each and every boy found his way into a suitable occupation, and he did it through a method that was little less than divinely inspired. It had come to him as a blinding revelation when he was but a small child. He had been playing Happy Families at the time and wondering why it was that families depicted on the cards should be so happy and his wasn't. And then it struck him. Bang! Right out of the blue. It was their names and the jobs they did. The two were magically linked. Mr. Bunn was a baker and Mr. Thread a tailor. That was it. It was so obvious that he marvelled that none should have seen it before him. If you wanted to be happy in life, then you had to find an occupation that began with the same letter as your surname. It was that simple. At first it made him somewhat sad, because he dearly wished to become a train robber, and then it made him somewhat fearful, the thought that he alone should possess this knowledge. But possess it he did, and there was no turning back. His future was mapped out for him. He would become Mr. Yarrow, the Youth Employment Officer, and bring happiness to thousands. And for the last 5 years he'd been doing just that. Certainly many parents seemed genuinely bewildered upon learning the nature of the job he had lined up for their offspring. A few had even become downright hostile. These spoke openly of ropes being thrown over high beams and towering feathers brought into play. But he had skilfully pacified even the most vociferous of dissenters. To those who did not respond to his sad soliloquies on the terrible social stigma which must naturally fall upon the parents who forbade their own child the opportunity of gainful employment and instead condemned him to a living purgatory of dole-queue misery, there was always the wall of shame upon which their names must be forever writ in letters big for destroying the glorious reputation of the school. For the most part, however, parents seemed pathetically grateful that their wretched boys had any job to go to. Mr. Yarrow turned papers upon his desk. The papers came from a big fat file. Upon this the name of Cornelius Murphy was written letters big. big and red. Murphy's final year had come to an end, and the loathsome boy remained without employment. It was a now legendary nightmare scenario. With the final minutes of the term ticking away, Mr. Yarrow had contacted Murphy Senior and frantic talks had taken place. An agreement had hastily been arrived at to the effect that Cornelius would be kept on at school for an indefinite period until matters could be expedited. During this 11th hour telephonic summit, Murphy Senior had proved himself to be a tower of strength and a fortress of moral rectitude. He could not countenance, he said, the thought that his only son should besmirch the good name of his own old alma mater, but neither could his conscience allow him to enter into duplicity. He suggested an inspired compromise. Cornelius would remain on at school until real work could be found for him, but during this period, in order that the school's reputation remain intact, he should be taken on in some capacity and paid a salary, that of a youth employment officer's assistant, for example. Mr. Yarrow willingly agreed, but a month had passed since then, a month which had seen less and less of Cornelius Murphy. Today, however, was Murphy's 4th payday. Mr. Yarrow was determined that it should be his last. The door opened and Cornelius Murphy was propelled into the science room. "Sit down." Mr. Yarrow did not look up from his papers. Cornelius chose a seat by the door. "Over here." A nicotined finger indicated the chair before the desk. Cornelius shambled over and sat down noisily. He smiled at Mr. Yarrow. Mr. Yarrow did not smile back. 3 feet of desktop separated them, and about 12 million miles. Mr. Yarrow made a purposeful face and turned foolscap pages before him. It was a slow and deliberate process. There was no sense of urgency about it. Cornelius studied the youth employment officer. He observed that his ears, made almost transparent by the sunlight, closely resembled a pair of human embryos, that the dandruff flecks on his left shoulder formed the configuration of Ursa Major, that the rich orange hue of the nicotined finger matched that obtained by the French painter Saint-Martin, who used to ground fragments from the heart of Louis XIV to achieve the effect, that a bead of perspiration above Mr. Yarrow's left eyebrow contained a microcosm of the visible universe. Mr. Yarrow continued to turn papers. At intervals he looked up at Cornelius and shook his head doubtfully. Cornelius found the habit mildly annoying, but as he prided himself that he could get through any interview with Mr. Yarrow without uttering a single word, he refrained from comment. At very great length Mr. Yarrow leaned back in his chair, sighed deeply and gazed upon Cornelius Murphy. "This is a fine pickle," he said. Cornelius nodded thoughtfully. A fine pickle and no mistake, he supposed. "Do you know what I think when I see a lad like you?" Cornelius shook his head. He didn't know, neither did he care. "I think, there but for the grace of God to go I." Cornelius smiled warmly and rose to go with God's grace. "Sit down." Cornelius sat down. "I think," Mr. Yarrow continued, squeezing his left earlobe and inflicting brain damage upon a metaphysical fetus, "I think, what can I do for this graceless lad?" Cornelius yawned. "Sit up straight, lad." Cornelius made a vain attempt to do so. His hair made an unscheduled port-side call. He forced it back to the starboard bow. "Your school reports," Mr. Yarrow prodded the offenders, "a tale of woe. Constant absenteeism, no team activities, poor exam results, chances thrown away, advice ignored, no attempts made to knuckle down and smarten up. Have you filled in the application form I gave you?" Cornelius recalled the form. It had become a paper dart. There had been mention of machine-minding on that form, and machine-minding star did not burn brightly in the Murphy firmament. "You've lost it, I suppose." Cornelius nodded. "Speak up." Cornelius nodded louder. "How many interviews have I sent you to?" Cornelius counted silently upon his fingers. "7, that's how many." Cornelius thought 7 seemed about right. He wasn't going to quibble. Mr. Yarrow read the list to himself. Mechanic, merchant seaman, minicab driver, monumental mason, motorcycle messenger, marriage counsellor, male model. Any one of these was surely right up Murphy's street. What was the matter with the boy? Didn't he want to be helped? Mr. Yarrow shook his head. He'd never known a boy to fail 7 interviews. But curiously, as he perused once more the reasons given for Murphy's rejection. They hardly seemed to be the tall boy's fault. He had been considered too well-spoken to be a minicab driver, too sophisticated to be a marriage counsellor, too rugged to be a male model, yet too delicate to be a mechanic, and so on and so forth. I don't get it. Mr. Yarrow shook his head once more. I send you along to 7 interviews. Clearly you do your best. The interviewers call me, praising you as an excellent chap, but then they abjectly apologise that due to some ludicrous technicality they cannot employ you. How can anyone be too tall to be a monumental mason? Cornelius shrugged. Something to do with the average height of tombstones, he supposed. I just don't get it. Mr. Yarrow went on. Your schoolwork is appalling, yet you shine at interviews. You shine at interviews, yet no one is willing to employ you. It's a fine pickle and no mistake about it. Inwardly, Cornelius agreed that it probably was. Mr. Yarrow tugged a long card index box across the desk and set about it with a bespittled finger. Cornelius observed that the wooden bobbin dangling on a string from the window blind was the shape of an acorn, a relic of the belief that the orc, the sacred tree of the thunder god, could protect you from lightning. Yaha! Mr. Yarrow plucked a card from the box and waved it in the air. Gotcha! He smiled at Cornelius. Cornelius found the experience unsettling. I have it. Just the ticket. His eyes narrowed upon Murphy. Do you know what I have here? Cornelius shook his head. Are you sure? Cornelius nodded. Mr. Yarrow chuckled. Are you sure you're sure? Cornelius nodded again. Mr. Yarrow chuckled again. Sure you're sure you're sure? Cornelius scratched his head, inciting further wavy rebellions. Perfect. Yeah, perfect. The youth employment officer took a form from a folder, filled it in with his fountain pen, blotted it, folded it into an envelope, sealed this, printed a name and address thereupon in big black capitals, blotted this and handed the whole to Cornelius Murphy. There, he said. Now be careful not to lose it. Go straight to the address and ask for Monsieur Messidor. And just be yourself. Do you understand? Don't try too hard. Just be yourself. Cornelius looked bemused. Perfect, crowed Mr. Yarrow. That's the stuff. Off you go now. I'll phone to say that you're on your way. Cornelius rose to his feet, knocking over his chair. Normally this was met with a stony stare, but not this time. This time, Mr. Yarrow roared with laughter and said perfect once again. Cornelius paused a moment to extend his right hand. Mr. Yarrow paused a moment before placing a wage packet into it. Cornelius nodded his thanks. Mr. Yarrow clapped his hands together. By the time Cornelius had reached the door, the youth employment officer was already tidying his desk, and by the time Cornelius had left the playground and taken to the street, his feet were up and the cigarettes were out. The sun shone in at the science room window. Outside on the cork heap, a retired tomcat dreamed about Clara Bow. The ash bowl was full and the cigarette packet empty when the telephone finally rang. Monsieur Messidor spoke in a thick French accent. He had never met such a boy, he enthused, a boy whose future celebrity was assured by his sparkling personality, combined with a fearsome intellect. He could not thank Mr. Yarrow enough for having introduced him. He would be a gredon, second only to receiving the Légion d'honneur, to take and train this talented boy. Mr. Yarrow breathed a great and heartfelt sigh of relief. At last, Baudelaise, continued the voice of Monsieur M. Regretfully, Master Murphy is too well endowed to be a mime artiste. Mr. Yarrow buried his face in his hands and began to weep. In a nearby telephone box, Cornelius Murphy gently replaced the receiver, much as he had done 7 times before, 8 if you counted the famous 11th hour summit. The world awaits, said Mr. Murphy the mimic. And so it did.